Pop Shield, a long-form discussion podcast about musical topics both past and present. I'm Gabe, and I'm joined, as always, by Dan.
Hello.
And Darren.
Hello.
So I like to start each episode by asking you guys if you've listened to anything interesting lately.
Yeah, the new Swans demo CD for the next record came out. What Is This? It's called. So been listening to that. Spoiler, gonna be another classic.
I have just been listening to the Olivia Tremor Control.
Fitting. I have been, I'm starting to think it's Anco's year because I really dug Panda Bear's Buoys, and now I am really into A.V. Tear's new album, Cows on Hourglass Pond. It's very dreamy and kind of slow, but these melodies, like they are slow to kind of work their way into your head, but once they're there, they are stuck there. I just think it's really, really, really solid. Highly recommended. Now, Dan, speaking of Swans, am I getting this wrong? You have some field trip to report on?
Yeah, I finally went to a concert this year. It's like the longest I've ever waited. My wife and I, we went to Philadelphia for our anniversary, and while we were there, just randomly stumbled on Norman Westberg from Swans was playing at this place called the Philadelphia Mausoleum of Contemporary Art. It's in a old store that sold tombstones and mausoleums. So real spooky.
Okay.
Wow.
And it's in the neighborhood that inspired Eraserhead, which is my favorite movie, which is cool. And it's also, the building is owned by Diplo and used to be the headquarters for his record label. Like right when you walk in on the floor, it says Mad Decent or whatever the name. So that's kind of like weird. But the actual show, it was rad. He was opening for some other band that I've never heard of, and honestly, we left before they played. But he just did some solo guitar drones, really just fucking around with pedals and real ambient stuff. But it was like really tight. He just played like 35 minutes. Tons of delay, reverb. All that shit I like. It was really cool. It was cool to see like him in a different context, not so loud and, insane as Swans normally is. But it was really cool.
Wow. There's a lot of pop culture colliding in that one spot.
I know.
Forming into some big combination, if you will, which leads me to our topic today. Combinations, you get it? Okay, that's okay. March 23rd marked the 20th anniversary of the Olivia Tremor Control's second and last proper LP, Black Foliage Animation Music Volume 1. And while we all love this album, we were surprised to see what feels like a hidden gem being celebrated by retrospective reviews in Stereogum and The Quietus, as well as pretty active discussions by fans and music critics on forums like Reddit and Twitter. We're always interested in why certain albums inspire these kinds of reassessments. There was very little fanfare for the 20th anniversary of the band's first LP, Dusk at Cubist Castle, for example. So we decided to revisit Black Foliage ourselves and try to figure out what makes this album such an enduring classic. I guess we should start with our personal histories with this album. Dan, are you a big fan? When did you find this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge fan of Elephant Six in general. I've loved Neutral Milk Hotel, especially, and of Montreal. Olivia Tremor Control has always sort of been like a second tier band of that for me personally. Like they're still great, just I've never been like super obsessed with them. But I do love this album, and I love Dusk at Cubist Castle. But I've just never been like incredibly obsessed with it like I get with a lot of other stuff.
So you hadn't listened to it that much in the last however many years?
No, it had been quite a while since I had listened to it, which, was nice to revisit.
How about you, Darren?
Well, obviously Neutral Milk Hotel was the first band from Elephant Six that I had listened to. I remember, Gabe, you turned me on to it, and I recall very vividly thinking, is Gabe just trying to be like so patrician by listening to this guy who I couldn't understand why you liked Jeff Mangum's voice. That was like the most off-putting thing at first. You know what I mean?
Huh.
That obviously later changed, and so I was like, oh my God, I need more of this. Let me dig into this Elephant Six. What a crazy, cool idea this sounded like. And I think the first band that I checked out was Beulah. Elephant Six, which is just
interesting start.
Right. You put that on and I'm like, well, what the hell? This is nothing like Neutral Milk Hotel at all. And the third band that I checked out was the Olivia Tremor Control. And I pretty much immediately fell in love with this record that we're going to talk about, and then also loved Dusk at Cubist Castle. And I've kind of always, maybe in the most recent 5 years or so, I may have only listened to it a few times, but like when I first listened to it, man, this thing was on all the time for me. Like, what a huge inspiration. Obviously, we'll talk about that a whole lot more, but what about you, Gabe?
Yeah, I had a similar story where I, fell under the spell of Neutral Milk Hotel's In the Airplane Over the Sea, and eventually went digging for, what else I could find like it, learned about this Elephant Six thing, just went deep into that wormhole, and Olivia Tremor Control became one of the, one of my absolute favorites, and probably, maybe we'll talk about this on a future episode. I hope we do at some point, but it's like, I find it very hard to revisit In the Airplane Over the Sea. I just spent so much time with it. But honestly, over the past, several years, I revisit Olivia Tremor Control every once in a while, and always really love it, always have. I mean, it's just, not to spend too much time on it, but it was like, this whole Elephant Six thing was something I had never heard before. I was kind of remembering today, maybe I was in 9th grade or 10th grade or something, and it was just like, I put on in the Airplane Over the Sea, and I remember asking somebody on this music forum I was on at the time, like, is this Holland 1945 song supposed to be so distorted and fucked up sounding? Like, do I have a bad copy or what? I must have heard, it was like, I must have heard, I don't know, early Modest Mouse by that point, but didn't think of lo-fi as like an artistic choice. I just thought of it as like a recording limitation. So then just hearing something like the Olivia Tremor Control that just makes the most of that and makes a whole world out of it, I just couldn't believe it. So I think we should try to describe the sound. Now, I assume most people listening to this episode know this album pretty well, but I think part of the fun of this album is actually trying to describe, what the heck it is. So what does this record sound like?
Yeah, I mean, it's really kind of hard to describe. The easy way, and what I think most people would say is, it's sort of got that 60s psychedelic rock, Beach Boys worship, Beatles worship kind of thing going on. But there's more to it than that, of course. It's very like dream-like. That Stereo Gum article like said some things that I thought were really good, like disembodied, barely corporeal. They said, and I liked both of those as descriptions. It's very dreamy, very dream-like. Maybe not dreamy, but yeah, it's 60s psychedelic rock through some weird, distorted, lo-fi, dreamy lens.
Yeah, I liked what the Stereo Gum guy, the other one, which was about the garden. Like, I actually liked that imagery of like, beautiful flowers, but also like, appreciating the weeds and the the not so beautiful things about the garden. Because when I think about this album, it literally mashes together the world of like experimental music and like the most genuine, purest pop from the 60s. Absolutely. You know what I mean?
Harmonies, just glorious harmonies.
I mean, I think of like, you mentioned the Beach Boys, the Beatles, like I think of like Revolution 9, but with like Beach Boys harmonies happening over it. You know what I mean? Like, it's a really interesting blend, and I obviously will get deeper into that, but that's how I would describe it.
Yeah, it's there's something incredible about it because it's just their knack for hook writing is stunning, and yet on this album they really, it's like a constant tease, I think, where it's just these explosions of pop harmony and just that 60s psychedelic pop thing, but just constantly kind of disappearing in like a wash of insane cacophonous sounds. Dan, you said dreamlike, and you were very careful to correct yourself and not say dreamy, because the album is not really relaxing or peaceful in any way. It's dreamlike in the sense of, like Alice in Wonderland, like falling down this, rabbit hole thing where you can't like ever, get a grip on anything. Sounds are,
it's illogical, like the way a dream doesn't make sense, it's not always a comforting dream. It's not always, a nightmare or anything. Yeah.
Right.
It just has that weird, Alice in Wonderland is a good analogy, I think.
Yeah, and I think a good, touchstone here, people say that this is the case for like the entire Elephant Six, and I find that a little wrong, but specifically here, the Beach Boys' Smile is like a huge, point of influence. I think the idea of Smile as this, I'm sure everybody knows, but this album that was supposed to be, recorded as a bunch of individual little pieces and then somehow assembled together into like one glorious medley or symphony or something. It's kind of building off of that because there are just many very small ideas. I like AllMusic's review of this album says there are basically enough ideas here for 5 different albums, which I think is a great way to put it. So, this is all very interesting and unique, and we'll dive more into it. But beyond describing the sound, what makes it a great album?
I think one of the things that makes it great, and Darren, you sort of alluded to this a little bit, Revolution 9 was like John Lennon trying to incorporate music concrete into pop music. You can argue how much of a success he had with it. I think here they're doing that same thing. They're building off of Lennon's idea, and kind of it's working. Whereas you could argue it sort of failed with the Beatles. They're marrying 2 genres that are from totally different worlds.
Yeah.
And I think and that's something that Elephant Six as a whole sort of does, and I think that's why they're so appreciated. But especially Olivia Tremor Control, I think they do it super well.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, didn't Lennon say, I don't know if it was about Revolution 9 specifically, but didn't he say something like, this is what the future of music is going to be like,
Mm-hmm.
This album sounds like a bridge between what, Lennon was experiencing in the 60s and what he may have imagined as being the future, pure experimental noise, like rhythmless music, which exists today, obviously, but the Olivia Tremor Control did something that, like, I hesitate to sit here and just say is unheard of and it's never been done before, but I really don't know too many bands that have done it so well. You think about the Beach Boys' Smile, and while it was successful enough, even though it never really truly was released, you can tell reading up on it that it was a massive undertaking. And this album, I feel like, succeeds because it kind of gets over that hump. It actually reaches a completion. It is a completed album. It has like tons and tons of ideas, but when you listen to it, I don't get any sort of feeling that like anything was missing. You know what I mean? Or that something wasn't finished. This sounds like a tireless masterpiece that was like labored over, you know what I mean? And it comes across as like a not perfect, but a completed piece, whereas some of these other albums that were and ideas we're talking about were just experiments that may have never finished.
Mm-hmm.
This album succeeds because I feel like they actually get there. They get to the end point. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's interesting because it has sort of a narrative to it, like a musical narrative, because I gave Dusk at Cubist Castle a spin this week as well. And I was kind of surprised to find that it wasn't as weird as it sounded, the first time I ever put it on, which, like I said, was such a brand new experience for me at that time. And I didn't mention, but Dusk at Cubist Castle I got very obsessed with. And then it was, and I had kind of like checked this out, but found it a little difficult. And it was you, Darren, that really pushed me to give Black Foliage the equal attention. So returning to Dusk at Cubist Castle, it's interesting because the first half is kind of like these perfectly crafted pop songs. There's some weird arrangement going on, but they are damn tight. And I would say maybe the hooks are better on Dusk at Cubist Castle overall. And then a weird thing happens on that album where like the rug is just pulled out from under you with the green typewriter suite.
Oh, yeah.
Where like it's really been pretty solid, where aside from a few exceptions, you've got like these kind of basically 3-minute, 2.5-minute, like perfect 60s psych pop songs kind of. And then there's like a series of green typewriter tracks that are like short, half-finished ideas. And then you just go into like this pure drone for like 9 minutes before it like sort of emerges, but never even really recovers because it remains totally deconstructed like that. Black Foliage is like a much more successful, I think, combination of those two impulses. Because, like I said, it's got this narrative where you're kind of, going through these pop songs that are constantly threatening to fall apart. A lot of times, like a peculiar noise called Train Director. The end of it just changes directions completely, and it's such a catchy song. You're kind of like wishing it would come back, but it just moves on into these, into like a 5-second combinations, which is just like a little blast of noise, back to pure pop of Hideaway before like completely falling apart for a couple short tracks. It's like this constant push and pull. And then, there are points where the bridge will be such a strange diversion. And you're like, no, I love that song. Like, come back, please don't end it. And then sometimes it will. Sometimes it will come back like in this unexpected way. Sometimes things will come back way later in the album. But my point is that instead of just like a sudden, abrupt, rug being pulled out from under you, it's like planted throughout the album that this thing is going to fall apart at some point. And it does. We'll talk about that like huge sound collage thing that sort of happens later on. But you know what I mean? It's like more. Well, it feels like building,
right? It feels like it earns that 11-minute, track. You know what I mean? You have gone through so much of the album by that point. You've heard all of the different soundscapes, even if they were in small snippets, and now you've arrived at basically 11 minutes of that, like a culmination of all of the album that you had just heard. When Green Typewriters comes on, I'm like, wait, I want more of the album. Like, where are we going? You know what I mean? By the time I get to like the Bark and Below It, I'm like kind of prepared, I feel like.
Yeah.
No, I think that's perfect. Green Typewriters like really kind of comes from left field a little bit, whereas you're expecting a Bark and Below It, and maybe not expecting it, but like you're not expecting 11 minutes of it, but you're expecting at least like a handful of it,
you're not quick to like want to change the track, you know what I mean? Like, you're like,
exactly.
Right,
you give it
ease into this.
Exactly. It's like easier to give it a chance. I think this record just like never lets you get comfortable, which I think sort of like plays to that dream thing I talked about. When you have a dream, like dreams don't actually last. Sometimes they feel like they're hours long, but they're really like very short and come and go and whatnot. And they don't have like a full narrative or anything. Maybe you're
right,
doing something, and then all of a sudden now different dream. And this record like sort of is like that. You start settling in a place, and then we're going this direction now. We're going back here. Sometimes you hop back. Right. I really like that about this record.
Yeah, it's like in a dream where you might like walk through a door and suddenly you're in a completely different location.
Exactly.
Like you didn't physically move anywhere, but everything has just shifted suddenly, and you can't go back. You know what I mean?
And rarely is that pulled off so well, like you guys were saying. It comes together one cohesive thing. And so what I want to ask is, are there any standout tracks for you guys, or, is it impossible to pull things apart from the entire piece?
I mean, I think it works better as an entire piece, but as I've said on the podcast before, I'm a real stickler for like listening to an album as a piece of art that the people intended. But I mean, there's definitely songs on here that like get stuck in my head a little bit. Sleepy Company gets stuck in my head quite a bit. I have been floated. A peculiar noise called Train Director. Pieces of that all get stuck in your head. So like in a way, I would say those are the standouts. But I would never say, check out those songs, and then if you like them, check out them. I would say no, listen to the record. So yes and no.
Yeah, this is an album I've never really tried to pluck songs from to put on a playlist or anything that because even though the songs are so good, like Hideaway, so good, Grass Cannons, like so good, but you can't just pull it out, you know what I mean, and throw it in a playlist because by the end of the song it's like already changed and shifted going into something else.
It loses its luster a bit.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, that might be the case because I think some of those songs on Dusk at Cubist Castle, they shine a little bit brighter on their own, but these songs really require this setting. At the same time, there are songs on here that I think just kind of sum up what is so wonderful about this album. Grass Cannons, you mentioned, Darren, is like one of my absolute favorites. It's got kind of a darkness to it, and there are a couple points in this album where the melody gets quite dark and serious. It kind of reminds me of, the Circulatory System, the first Circulatory System album after this, which always strikes me as like darker, and yet there's more of the sing-along stuff, which is an interesting sort of conflict. But yeah, there's an interesting darkness here, which I think is an important part of, this sort of dream world that's being created. It's not all sunshine, 60s pop. You mentioned I Have Been Floated, Dan. I mean, that song is so interesting because the arrangement is like completely reconfigured on every section. So it's kind of like it's a verse, chorus, verse type of song, but like no instruments are the same on the second verse as they are on the first verse.
And not only that, but the voices, like so many people from Elephant Six are on that song. Mangum, Kevin Barnes, everybody's like on it, and it's like you can't even tell. It'll shift between singers, and sometimes you're like, that's definitely Kevin, and you're like, is that Jeff? Is that Robert? And like, it's another sort of dream type thing, like if you have a dream, sometimes you're talking to, I don't know, your mom, and then all of a sudden, now it's your aunt or something, like things like that,
your girlfriend.
Yeah,
it's like almost like so on the nose, like calling the song "I Have Been Floated" and then just like floating in these different people, you know what I mean? Like,
no, exactly. Yeah. It's something that like when you just say that, like that sounds fucking corny as shit, but like somehow they really pull it off. Like it sounds great. It's like I really love that song. I love like. Just last night, I was listening to it, and I was like, I turned it up as loud as it would go in my headphones because I was like trying to figure out who was singing what, because I recognize all the people's voices and stuff, and it's like
some of them seem like the pitch has maybe been altered.
Yeah, I was thinking that
which makes it even harder.
Because that last chorus is the one that really stands out to me as like the pitch changing, and I cannot. I have no idea who's singing that.
Yeah, I listened to it like 3 times in a row, just trying to like pick exactly who was singing what, and it was basically impossible.
Yeah, really, a lot of this album, it keeps sort of like warping out of focus just as you think you've got a handle on it.
Which is how a dream is. I don't want to keep bringing it up, but, if you look at a clock in a dream, you know how it changes on you and stuff. Yeah, it's exactly like that.
At the same time, though, I wanted to mention, in regard to I've Been Floated, Jeff Mangum's voice, shines through pretty bright there. And this must be the case for everybody, but you're obsessed with animals or with Elephant Six. You probably started with Neutral Milk Hotel, and just hearing him like emerge there is so exciting. And yet, I was thinking about what we talked about last week, where there's kind of this egoless quality to 60s vocals. Remember we talked about how Jim Morrison is like the first real front man because he's like there and he's present, and it's his charisma carrying everything. Whereas all the 60s music, you think about the Beatles and the Beach Boys, it's like this blend. It's supposed to sort of blend in. The Olivia Tremor Control do such an amazing job of that, where it's like this kind of egoless, it just makes it feel like maybe sort of true to the 60s, but also like the pre-frontman era, but also kind of, there's something about like this contextlessness to it, where it's just like, who is this? Is this even the same person from the last songs we were kind of talking about? And in contrast, I think Jeff Mangum has more of like a voice, like he is a star singer. You know what I mean, Darren?
Yeah, oh yeah, definitely. Even yes, there's something about the quality of his voice that you can't mistake it. Like on "I Have Been Floated," you know when it's Jeff Mangum singing for sure. And I get what you're saying, like totally, because like you think of Neutral Milk Hotel, but really, just like I described, like how the Doors were really Morrison is he's the centerpiece. Same with Mangum and Neutral Milk Hotel, you know what I mean? But the Olivia Tremor control, just like you said, like, it's weird. When you listen to this band, I never think about, like, Will Hart or, what's the other guy's name?
Bill Doss.
Bill Ross.
Bill Doss.
Like, Doss.
Doss, sorry. I don't think about...
The man died. You got to respect him.
Yeah, I know. God.
But see, that's just it. Like, I don't ever think about, like, the individual names or individuals.
They're kind of anonymous on purpose.
Yeah, for sure.
So my question is, we kind of already touched on it, but I mean, what takes this beyond 60s pastiche and like just simple Beach Boys worship? Because I feel like Dusk at Cubist Castle, listening now, it kind of falls into that a little bit more, where sometimes it sounds like people emulating the 60s, and it's a little bit more, it's a lot closer, I would say, to kind of early Apples in Stereo or early Of Montreal, where it's like, Kevin Barnes is like, all right, this is going to be like a weird circusy kind of, Baroque pop song. It's going to sound like, whatever, Phil Oakes or something, like these really deliberate kind of evocations of certain sounds. I feel like that's happening less on this album, a lot less. This sounds like Olivia Tremor control. I almost can't even describe it any other way. Are you guys kind of on board with that?
No, I agree. Yeah, I mean, Dusk at Cubist Castle is a lot more of that pastiche Beach Boys worship type thing. Here, I think what gets them away from that is they're marrying the Beach Boys and 60s pop with Stockhausen and Cage and everything, and they just do it so well in a way that, like, I think a lot of people have maybe tried. I mean, like I said, even the Beatles tried it and kind of failed a little bit. And since they're sort of the first ones, at least that I could think of, that like really succeed with it, and so it becomes it kind of becomes its own new thing. So they're just. I get that that's just sort of pastiching more pastiche, but I think that works. I mean, every like genre of music basically is sticking together some older genres and making a new one, so I think that's sort of what gets it away. Does that make any sense at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like you guys mentioned, Dusk at Cubist Castle, contains some like fantastic songs that you could just jump in and listen to and not necessarily have to go through the entire album. You could truly exit before Green Typewriters if you wanted to, and you'd be fine. I mean, you would have gotten, the best parts of that album, I would argue. Whereas here, I feel like, they took the next step, right? Like they had the ideas. Gabe, you mentioned it earlier. They truly like marry these two concepts together, not only in like having little soundscapes in these combination tracks and the Black Foliage tracks, but in the songs themselves. For instance, Paranormal Echoes starts off sounding like you're going through another Black Foliage or some sort of like combination, right. And then it changes. It just so naturally shifts into an actual song, and songs themselves will like shift. And I find myself even now sometimes looking down and saying, okay, what track am I on again? Because it's just it's changed. And like we talked, like I just mentioned, how I don't even know how many people are in this band. I don't think about the individuals of this band. I really also don't think too much about what track am I on. You know what I mean? Like I don't always know. Obviously, some of like the main heavy hitters, I've Been Floated. Yeah. I know I'm on that track, but like throughout the album, man, I'm like, it doesn't even matter to me where
you get lost in it.
Exactly that. It's so hard to just put words to that, feeling. You know what I mean? But it just it's so different than like Dusk at Cubist Castle.
That leads me to a question I had, though. There's all these little tiny tracks, the combinations and animation like tracks that are, some of them are a couple minutes long, some of them are like, one's like 4 seconds or something. Like they do all that and that's fine, but then they also, in the like regular, quote unquote regular songs, they also kind of do the same thing. So does it even, are the combinations and the animations even sort of necessary, since they seem to do the same thing, kind of tacked onto regular songs?
Yeah, it's a little strange, because, I'll listen to, like, there's this little stretch early on. It's like combination. Well, actually, it's really, after Hideaway, you got like Black Foliage Animation 1, combinations, and the sky is a harpsichord canvas. And they range from like just a couple seconds to whatever, a minute. And, it's like 3 tracks that just fly right by, all connected. And then there'll be other parts where I'm just thinking like it's at the end of a song and it just kind of transforms like multiple times really fast. And I'm like, well, that could have been 3 tracks also.
Part of me wonders, something like the sky is a harpsichord or whatever, like, that's the 4-second one. Like, is it just they thought of like a funny track title and they, wanted to jam it in there? Like I just wonder, like, why are some connected and some aren't connected?
They're thinking about all the streams they were going to get in the future.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. That's smart.
Well, I was kind of thinking, in also in response to this idea of like what takes it beyond 60s pastiche, there's kind of like a interesting, not to get too like ridiculous, but like a postmodern kind of self-awareness to this album where, the medium is often part of the message. You know what I mean? It's not like lo-fi because that's the best they could do. That might actually be why, but it's lo-fi because that's the sound that they're after. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the, like there are sounds that are clearly taped sounds sped up like crazy or slowing way down, or even sounds that, sort of resemble like and probably really are like a tape being mangled, by a machine. There's like a real kind of upfrontness about the, in a minute, I'm going to go like way artsy on this, but like the instability of the medium or something like that, like because the thing is sort of falling apart, the album, the dream is falling apart, like we've been talking about, it's a nice parallel that you kind of feel like the tape is fucked up when you're listening to this. And that's what I kind of think of when I think of those like little blip songs that often don't even flow into the next one. It's just like, and then like, that's it. You kind of get what I'm saying? Am I going too far here?
No, I get you. And in fact, on I was reading the Wikipedia for this record earlier today, and it says that on California Demise Part 3, there's like a skip, and the band like noticed it when they were listening to the master playbacks, and they said, yeah, leave it. Sounds good. Yeah. And like that's sort of like that. It was unintentional, but it's sort of that destruction of and I noticed the skip listening to it, but I really didn't think of it as an error. I didn't hear it and say, right. They missed that
it's
one. It's
appropriate.
It like feels like it's part of the record, the happy accident or whatever that Bob Ross guy says.
Yeah, I agree with both of you. And I just wanted to add kind of to the recording element of this. Gabe, we used to talk about like the whole Elephant Six recording concept that they had. They had like a house or something, or they rented out a house or whatever it was, and all of the different members would just kind of file in and do different things. And I don't know for sure whether like this record in particular was recorded in the same sort of method, but
it is
on Grass Cannons. Okay, so on Grass Cannons, it starts out and it sounds like so like I feel like I'm in the room, like I can just hear the sound of each of these like instruments, like the stringed instruments being played. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
And
right.
I absolutely, it's like one of my favorite moments on this record of any Elephant Six record, because it's, it was so inspiring when I was like in a band and trying to write music and stuff, to like hear, people who, this whole Elephant Six collective of different artists and the wide range of genres and music, but the way they would just kind of come together and float in and out on each other's records and give ideas. I mean, I'm sure like tons of members of the Elephant Six are probably all over this record, and we don't know specifically what they were doing, but just that whole element of how it was recorded, I think, comes through so well, and especially on Grass Cannons, do I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I thought basically the same thing. You know, there's sometimes like when there's like little sort of toy piano sounds, or like xylophone, but it doesn't sound like a professional it sounds like a maybe a kid's toy or something you would get at school or something. And it does. It feels like they're sitting in a living room or a bedroom recording, and somebody's got a toy piano that they found at the thrift store or something and jumped in. It really like sort of has that like communal feel to it. The singing Saul from Julian Coster is like all over this record, coming in and out. The trumpets and everything, it's mostly Scott Spillane from Neutral Milk Hotel, like all over. I really like that. It just sometimes like the song, it seems like, oh, well, Julian's over today, so let's throw the saw on this motherfucker. Yes. And I really like that. It does. It has that like that really, art community type feel to it. And I think that's like one of the greatest things about Elephant Six is it just feels like a group of friends that all like decided to make a ton of art together, I just can't think of anything else that in music that's really like that. And it's an inspiring thing when you're younger, and it's just cool. Yeah. It's just really, it's kind of like what you, I don't know, what like everybody sort of dreams of, artsy people at least.
Right. Like a cool community, a cool scene.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think that's another part of this album's self-awareness, because basically we have this Black Foliage motif, all right? There are actually a couple motifs that sort of repeat throughout the album, but specifically the Black Foliage motif or motifs, they're kind of like reinvented, across, 5 different pieces, but then there's also itself, or maybe itself, itself, so 6 total. Reconfigurations of this one piece. And it's interesting because what you were just saying, Dan, I think they're really aware of that, and they are embracing it and making that part of the album. They're kind of saying, look, this song sounds the way it does because of who happened to come over today, and that's how we create, because I just find it so interesting that we get Black Foliage itself, track 17, and you kind of feel like, oh, I see what they're doing. We're getting like these little, weird deconstructions of these motifs, and then we're going to get the song, and it's going to make sense. But then we get 2 more deconstructions of Black Foliage before the album ends. And I think the point is Black Foliage itself, quote unquote, is not like the correct song. It's just one of what could have been like thousands of recombinations. We get this idea of combinations throughout the album that I referenced earlier. You get what I'm saying? Like that it's not like, it's just so aware of that's how we create music, is like there are accidents and chance things that happen. You know what I mean?
I think that like what you said is perfect. And I think that's one of the things that really makes this record and Olivia Tremor Control stand out in Elephant Six. I feel like they are the band that sort of seems the most communal. When you listen to In the Airplane Over the Sea,
yeah, for sure,
it seems to mostly it seems like a band made this, and for the most part it is. Right. There's a little bit of clout. Laura Carter's on it, and there's a couple little things here and there, but for the most part the songs in total are either just Jeff or they're the same kind of instruments over and over. Avery Island's same way, even Early of Montreal is like that, but Olivia Tremor Control is the one that seems like the band is Elephant Six, they are
the spirit of
like you said, Darren. It's sort of, you don't know who's in that band. I mean, I know because I've read a bunch of shit about all these bands, but if I wasn't, obsessed with reading crap, I wouldn't know that, and I wouldn't be able to figure it out, because like you said too, it's hard to even tell, was the person that was singing on the last song singing on this song? It really does. Right. Elephant Six has this thing called major organ and the adding machine, which actually is the communal band. But Olivia Tremor Control sounds so much better and embodies that so much more. I think that
it captures the joy of the experience much better, another thing, a couple things I wanted to mention that, the conversation kind of slipped on by, but, in regard to this, using the lo-fi as part of the album, there are also moments, though, that are like, I am stunned at the arrangements that they create under these like 4 and 8 track conditions. I think about like, a Sleepy Company. How that sort of string section comes in at the end. It kind of like falls apart and then it sort of comes back. Quite. You're quite happy when it comes back because it was so short before, but. Like, you kind of know what I'm saying, Darren? Like, 'cause you were kind of hinting at the same thing, but like the strings on that section, and then there are all these other instruments going on, and it just sounds like, it sounds like a symphony of sound, and you just cannot believe that under those conditions, they are creating something like that huge and that, gorgeous. It's like, it's like buried under the hiss and fuzz, but so much is going on, and you can really put on some nice headphones and hear every little thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. And like I mentioned, I pointed out Grass Cannons just because in that moment in the beginning, it really just sounded like you were there in the room. But you know what? The rest of the album, really difficult to discern like what is going on or how they're actually achieving some of these recordings. It's really incredible.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of a nerd about like production and I just really like to know how people like recorded things and stuff. So this record is fun. At like night with your night's headphones on and knowing they only had either 4 or 8 tracks to work with, to listen to it and just try to like figure out what tracks are what and stuff, and what they're doing, and it's like it's goddamn like impossible, like they're doing so much with so little. It's really for being lo-fi and stuff, it really sounds like a choice more than a limitation, even though I think in reality it actually was a limitation. But they like just do it so well and embrace it, and I don't know, it's like they got so lucky, like with all these people just happen to end up together,
and know how to play all these like that way. Orchestra instruments.
It's like really,
but sometimes it's charming though that like you could tell the horns are not like they're kind of amateur, they're not
but that's what's good about it. If it was Miles Davis instead of Scott Spillane playing it, I think it would lose quite a bit of the charm. It's nice to hear it being like a little messed up and stuff, and it, in a lot of like live performances and everything with Neutral Milk Hotel and Olivia Tremor Control and stuff in those like holiday tours Elephant Six would do, like they really would be playing horn and like completely fuck it up and stuff, and it just like it gives it that like we sort of mentioned this, but it gives it that like feel. It's like I could do this, I love that about a lot of, I really love music that has that accessibility in it. When you listen to stuff where it's just people like, this guy is the best drummer you've ever heard. This guy's the best guitarist you've ever heard. That shit's boring as fuck. I want a little, I want a little soul in what I'm listening to. Anyone can take their whole life and just study and be so good at it, but it takes something else to just pick up a horn and, sort of figure it out well enough. You can get by, and, I don't know. I just love that, and it's super inspiring. You don't have to get all like, sort of emotional or whatever.
I shudder to think about this album being recorded with like a big budget and like a big.
Oh, it would be awful.
Right.
Oh, it would be so bad. It would be terrible.
And I just think it's so incredible because this is really the first album that I can think of that is both lo-fi and a like must hear on headphones kind of album. Now I think of the Microphones Glow Part 2 as kind of taking up the torch of this album quite specifically and really nailing that. It's like the example that most people would think of like, wow, you could make like a gorgeously crafted and arranged headphone album with, just nothing. But this album, with even greater limitations, I would say, somehow nails that. And I want to talk later about, what is this album's legacy or what influence did it have? But that's definitely one, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Now, another thing to get artsy, like I kind of promised earlier, I wanted to ask you guys, you got into it a little bit already, but I think there's a lot more to say, in how to approach this album. I want to know, like, what is the Black Foliage, if that can possibly be figured out. You guys mentioned it, the Stereo Gum review. I thought it was pretty great because it does kind of like, play with the idea of like, I feel like I need a metaphor to understand this. You guys mentioned they bring up a garden, which I love, because it's got that, like you said, Darren, there are the weeds, there are the flowers and everything. A dream we talked a lot about. They end up deciding it's just like a celebration of sound. This is a quote, an explication of the metaphysics of music, a treatise on the pleasures of hearing, which I also really like. But I have my own kind of thinking here, and I don't want it to get too long, but basically, a lot of people cite, the Beach Boys' Smile as the biggest inspiration on this album, and maybe just this band, and maybe even Elephant Six in general. I don't know why I keep wanting to say I guess they also kind of take up the tradition of Elephant Six and Olivia Tremor Control. But, what's interesting about that is that what Smile represents is like this unfinished thing that people want so badly to somehow combine together. Now, we live in an era where basically Brian Wilson, put out Smile. He basically finished Smile. And that box set that came out a few years ago, basically gave us what is just about the final thing. But Olivia Tremor Control exists in a world before that, right? Where Smile is like just a dream, kind of. You might have bootlegs that collect like all these little snippets, or maybe even try to make some combinations, but it's just anybody's guess, So you can it only like really exists in your imagination. And I kind of feel like more than the actual idea of Smile, this album is like related to Smile bootlegs. It's like deliberately not connected, or like not able to piece together. It's constantly like assembling, disassembling, and then reassembling itself. I think of like the Bark, whatever the full name is, that huge song, Bark and Below It. We could talk about this more, but it's got kind of like a stop-start thing to it, where it like actually goes into complete silence before kind of getting going again, And a lot of those pieces, in fact, I was happy to learn that I was kind of right, confirmation of my theory, where his interview with the Quietus, he's talking about, and I'm referring to Will Cullen Hart specifically, he's talking about every little sound from that piece is taken and manipulated from somewhere else in the album. So it's really kind of like this huge mess of like the entire album just completely disassembled and destroyed and like unobtainable. It just kind of makes me feel like the album is sort of like a meditation on the impossibility of assembling Smile. But I don't mean to like minimize it. It's not just about Smile. It's not like Basinski's Disintegration loops are just about like tapes falling apart. It's like about something a little bit bigger than that, like fading memories and stuff like that. I don't know how to perfectly phrase it, but just this idea of like disassembling, multiplicity of meaning, falling apart, disintegrating, all this stuff. You kind of with me on this, or am I going way too far?
No, I feel you. And I mean, not to bring it back up again, but I think that's part of what gives it that dream feel, because it's the same sort of thing happening in dreams. You never like wake up and remember it all.
And you can't put it back together no matter how hard you
exactly.
try.
You know, like everybody has that story of, they were in a great dream and then, something woke them up and then you try right. so hard to get back into it. It's right. like exactly, the same kind of thing. And yeah, Smile, I think what you said was really good. Smile at the point that this album was released and recorded and everything, Smile basically just was a dream. Yeah. Like there was tons of different bootlegs, but just like some guy put them together, not right. not anybody in the band specifically. Everybody sort of it was kind of a make your own record type situation until when did that Smile set come out? It was only
2011.
Yeah, so 8 years ago. So I don't think you're off base at all. And I think it's completely intentional on their part.
Yeah. And Darren, you said you like the garden metaphor, and I also really like that, like sort of in line with what I'm thinking here, because, a garden, you can like kind of tend to it as much as you want, but eventually, the weeds and time are just going to destroy it. It's like a living thing that's really, it's a fascinating metaphor of a garden, is that you can never really be fully controlled. So you kind of feel me on this, Darren?
Yeah, I can buy into that for sure. And I think, in the interview that Will gave, like, I'm really glad to hear that, like, the Barking Below It was not just, a mess of random sounds. Like, it really kind of changed that song for me, hearing that it was basically the entire album up until that point deconstructed. And, I think of it like as you can enjoy a garden in so many different ways. From a distance, you can just view it, you can get up close to it, you can smell it, you can dig in real deep and actually see the weeds and the dirt and the bug, whatever, like just all sorts of different things happening, living in there. And I think of like, that's kind of like what sound is, right? I mean, there are so many sounds out there, but you can hear things in an infinite number of ways. And Barking Below It is basically saying, hey, the entire album that you just heard, before this, it can be heard in so many different ways. Here's one of them. And it just completely tears it apart, and you really don't know what you're listening to. You know what I mean?
It like destabilizes the entire album, because you're kind of, just like with the Black Foliage animations, you're kind of like, well, this album could have been completely different if different band members had come over on different days.
Right.
It just really wants you to remember that. I also think about what you were just saying, like the Sylvan Screen. There are moments in there, because I really like how the Sylvan Screen is like, you think you're there, because like I was saying, how you're like, I know this album will be falling apart at some point, and we're gonna get some crazy, pure music concrete stuff. And it feels like the Sylvan Screen is going to be that for like 2 minutes. And then it kind of like goes into a song. It's a really nice fake out. But there are also moments where there's like this weird, it just feels like layers are being peeled off of that song. And now you're hearing like the song that was underneath it. Or the way like the end of Train Director, there's like this strange string diversion I was talking about earlier. And yet you can kind of like distantly hear the original song still going underneath it, even though it kind of has no relationship to what's happening there. So yeah, I love that idea of like, the underground, under the garden, the dirt, the weeds, all that stuff. And I also was just thinking in regard to finish my point with the Barking Below It. Hey, the Barking Below It. That's kind of exactly what you were saying, Darren. Wow, interesting. My mind is blown. But anyway, I was just thinking while listening to that, it was like the experience that I have, when I'm listening to the Smile box set and I'm listening to like 40 takes in a row of like this 20-second snippet or something like that. And I was like, God, you know what? This album sounds a lot more like the bonus discs of the Smile box set than actual Smile. And I think that's actually really cool.
Until you just said it, I didn't even think of the bark and below it. I always thought of like a dog bark. I didn't think of like a tree bark. And so like literally right now.
There's a lot of that really like garden imagery going on here, and a lot of stuff about, like multiplicity of meaning, this idea of like in the blink of an eye, you get several meanings, like how things can mean a bunch of things at the same time, and songs can sound a bunch of different ways at the same time. And we should also clarify before we get any like emails or anything by people know-it-alls, dreams are obviously pretty central to this album. We're not just like speculating, because the liner notes at of Dusk at Cubist Castle, they asked fans to record themselves describing their dreams, and a couple of these do get sampled on the record. Of course, we've also got the that sort of second, sort of in between album, Explanation 2, instrumental themes and dream sequences, which is supposed to be played with Dusk at Cubist Castle. Have you guys ever done that?
No, I haven't. I
never have it. I really want to.
I actually read that just today or yesterday. I didn't ever really know that. So I don't know how that slipped me by, but I wanted to. I was gonna do that this week.
I'm sure somebody on the internet has already synced it up.
Yeah, that would be convenient. I did that with that Flaming Lips record. I just laid them on top of each other and just would listen, to burn it to a disc.
What was the pitchfork? It was like, "Fuck you, I don't own 4 stereos."
That I kind of understand. But I wanted to ask you guys, when it comes to this album, it feels like we're not alone in trying. I mean, obviously the Stereo Gum review confirms this, but what is it about this album that just makes you want to figure out the metaphor?
I think just because it's sort of alien, it kind of it's weird. It's built on so much stuff you have heard, but then it comes out sounding like something you've never heard, and I think that just I think it has that mild sense of familiarity, it makes you want to the film familiarity makes it where you feel like you could figure it out because a little bit, and so it's pushing you towards it, but you can't actually ever figure it out because it's not your art. But it just that sort of straight, and again that's sort of how dreams frequently are with there's something about them that happened in your real life, or it's a place or a person or something, and then but it's also got this sort of strangeness to it. It makes you want to, why do people want to always figure out dreams? I think it's that same thing. It's that
that impulse.
Yeah, it's you feel the familiar, so you think it has to all be there when it's not.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Dan, that you mentioned the familiar, because I was just thinking the way this album is structured musically, it's meant to immediately attract you in with its glowing harmonies and 60s sound. That's easy, oh yeah, I'm very familiar with that kind of world, I can get into this. And then at the very same time, it's exposing its layers. It's saying, hey, yeah, there are layers here. Check this out. You know what I mean? You don't have to go searching for it. You're not force. It's not a situation where you're just trying to force a meaning into something.
Exactly.
Or it's gotta have some sort of deep meaning. No, it's pretty upfront with you, with all of the different, experimental, sounds, and then the names of the tracks. I think it's inviting you to dig into the layers. It's just an album that is. It's I don't know any other way of describing it other than to just say it's full of layers, and it's it knows it's full of layers. It's on purpose. You know what I mean? Not it's not hidden behind something. It's not meant to just be out there just for the sake of being weird or abstract. It knows it's abstract. It wants you to figure it out. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And, at the risk of contradicting myself, you mentioned, Dan, that there's enough familiar to pull you in. And I do kind of there are a couple tracks here that are really evoking something specific, I think.
Mm-hmm.
A place we have been to, I mean, really could have just been on Revolver, I think.
Hideaway is so Beach Boys, especially the end.
Yes, the ending. Yeah, I mean that is just clear. And I swear to God, if you just played that to me a couple weeks ago, I would have just said it was a Beach Boys song. I just can't remember which one.
Oh yeah. If I didn't know the track already, I would completely agree with you.
Something I think the end of Black Foliage 4 has this kind of harmonizing guitar, dwell, dwell, and it's so Brian Eno, Another Green World, just so much. And I think that, whereas on Dusk at Cubist Castle, it's maybe just leaning a little bit too close to the kind of pastiche vibe. On this one, those little familiar touches, they are enough to just make you keep wanting to figure this thing out. I also wanted to ask you guys, I don't think we've talked that much directly about what it was like kind of revisiting this album this week. Did any of your opinions change? You like it more? Do you like it a little less, or how'd it go?
I think my opinion maybe changed a little bit for the better. I was always like I said, at the top of the show, I've loved Elephant Six, but I was always like really a Neutral Milk Hotel fan. I mean, I still am. You said you don't even listen to Airplane much anymore. I love it. I have a Jeff Mangum drawing tattoo. I'm obsessed with it. And Olivia Tremor Control's always felt sort of second tier to me. And I've always sort of liked Dusk at Cubist Castle a bit more. But this week spending it with this record, and I purposely like didn't listen to Dusk because I didn't want to slip back into that. It made me like really sort of appreciate this record more. Whereas like in the past, if I listened to this record, it was because I was like. After I, when I got older, like if I was listening to this record, it was because I was like really going through, all the, next was going to be, Apples and Stereo and stuff.
Right.
Like that's kind of the only time I really got back into this record. So it was, I think this is the only time I've spent like a significant amount of time like only listening to this record over and over and over. Like I even had last night I sort of was like fuck, I want to listen to Cherry Peel, I want to listen to Avery Island and stuff. And I said
resist.
I said no, stick here. And it really did make me appreciate it quite a bit more, I think. It's an album I've always
stands on its own.
It's an album I would always say I've liked, but it gave me like a new, deeper appreciation for it, I think.
Yeah, I think I would agree. When we talked about doing this, I was kind of already thinking like, I love this album. It'd be fine. Like we could record it right now. Let's do it. But getting to go back into it, take a really deep dive into it, right, and just like absorbing it. I thought those articles were really good because it kind of like turned me on to some things I hadn't thought about before, you know what I mean? And just gave me an overall like deeper appreciation for this album, and actually excites me enough to like want to continue listening to it even beyond just doing this episode, because I feel like there's still more to discover and like enjoy about it, you know what I mean, outside of like I think in the early years when I was listening to it, obviously the early songs in the record were they were great, like, and that was the first thing I fell in love with. But as we have already kind of been discussing, like the layers and the the different things to discover, like this album still for me has so much more to enjoy, and I look forward to continuing to listen to it.
I found it very interesting that these retrospective reviews they seem to be making a very conscious effort to just like divorce this album from the Elephant Six, from Dusk at Cubist Castle. You mentioned this, Dan, but I am in the same boat where it's like I would only really listen to this if I was going through a phase, and I would always, there's no time in my life where I listened to like just this album and not Dusk at Cubist Castle like within the next day or so.
Right.
And while I did kind of give Dusk at Cubist Castle just one spin this week, I tried really hard to stay focused on this one album, and I think it does. It for me personally, it just sounded a lot better that way. I mean, it just doesn't sound like tied to that place and time. It sounds, quite timeless. People throw that around a lot, but I mean, if any album deserves that term, it's this one, because you would never be able to figure out like when this even was made. Yes. I think
yes,
as part of the idea. I did want to ask you guys any criticisms. I wanted to kind of bring up, just in the devil's advocate kind of way, some things like, there's some like off-key singing here. Do you guys, some like really abrupt cuts and stuff. We talked about maybe the possible meaning of some of that stuff. Weird mixing, like where something is just so loud all of a sudden. Does it kind of add to the charm the same way you guys were saying, like not great trumpet playing does?
I think 100%. The little off-key singing, a little, fuck up in the mixing. That's the stuff like I was saying earlier. I like that. I like the amateurish feel in music. Most things I like are things I feel like are accessible, reach, within like my own personal reach, sort of, So I like it. I didn't even. I can't even really think of like, oh, that's he went off key or anything. It like pisses me off if somebody doesn't ever, go off key. But also, my favorite artist ever is Bob Dylan. So,
Right. There you go.
Yeah, I mean, I love it. That all just kind of goes together with the Elephant Six and the whole vibe of the recording. Like I had mentioned before, that I felt so inspired by, and I feel like if you go back and you fix the the off key singing, if you go back and you try to tone down, there's one song in particular that I feel like really clips because there's just like so much going on, like you can barely hear the singing and stuff. You lose the impact. You know what I mean? And there's so many records that we've talked about that were big budget records, and we talk about how like, man, this would sound so much better if it wasn't recorded in a big studio. And what we're thinking of? When we say raw, we're talking about Elephant Six. We're talking about like this type of recording style right here. And to have something like this, I feel like is so precious.
That's something I love about Elephant Six is like, there's so many of those bands like Modest Mouse. Modest Mouse was fantastic, one of the greatest bands ever with all the lo-fi stuff, and then they get a major label deal. Moon Antarctica is still great, and then it just slowly slips away up until now. Strangers to Ourselves was fucking god awful, and now if you see them live, there's 30 goddamn people on stage, when there used to be 3 people. And Elephant Six, I feel like for the most part, you could maybe argue Of Montreal has gone the wrong way, but for the most part, these bands have stuck to that and not gotten shitty and overblown with time, which is super, super rare, I think.
Yeah. I think this was another thing that sort of changed in my perception this week was, I would have described this album as like meticulously crafted. And I think, you did again, Darren, and I think I kind of still would. And yet I never really appreciated the happy accident quality of this album. We talked about how, it sounds like some things are left up to chance, like little blips or little cuts or, little tape loops and sounds and stuff. And, I really kind of feel like sometimes they do a take, and I would have done another take because somebody was pretty off key for a moment there.
Yeah.
But there was something magical that they liked about that take or whatever, or maybe even it's just a matter of like they didn't have time because dude was, about to leave, and the song would sound totally different because he wasn't going to come back for 3 days, It's like there's something, it's like a balance between meticulously crafted and happy accidents, like I think you mentioned, Dan, as well. Couple other rapid fire devil's advocate type of things. Do you ever feel like some of the songs are kind of normal and there's just sort of like weirdness added on top?
I mean, I could see why someone would say that, but honestly, if someone said that, I would question their, and I don't want to sound like a dick, but I will. Like, I would question their like understanding of experimental music and stuff. Like when the weirdness is over top of it. I sometimes I say, oh, I mean, they're just aping, Stockhausen or something. And whereas maybe if you weren't familiar with that, I know I sound like a fucking pretentious asshole, but you know what I mean. Like I feel like it's sort of on purpose, and not in a pretentious way. So no, I don't think that.
Yeah, no, I don't. I wouldn't even consider that. I think if you lean into it, in which they do for like literally 70 minutes, you know what I mean?
That's perfect. As long as they lean into it, they're not. It's not accidental, right? Because that the Quietus article kind of like talks about a few individual tracks, like even mentions I've Been Floated and talks about it being like basically a ripoff, right?
Yeah.
I haven't listened to the record that it was mentioning that it ripped off, but I don't know. Yeah. It made me think about it, and that's why I mentioned at the top, like I hesitate to sit here and say like, well, there's just nothing else like it. I mean, of course there's probably things out there that are similar. They were obviously inspired by, just like everybody is inspired by. Else,
Elephant Six is basically built on its inspiration. So I don't think anything about Elephant Six is there's absolutely nothing like it. It's just, I think there's absolutely nothing else built on the same inspirations to create something new. And like I said much earlier in the show, I think basically all genres of music are built on one or two, genres that came before it, and you mash them together and now you've got something new. So I don't think there's anything like wrong or insincere about using your influences.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that they were calling it a ripoff of something specific. I think they were making the point that there are a couple songs that are just too, kind of like we were saying, like too much about just sort of emulating the 60s, but that by and large the album really like invents like sort of a new sound, even if it is built on something old, and I think I can understand that. How about the Bark and Below It? I think we talked about it a lot, but we could even throw in the combinations and the Black Foliage pieces. Specifically, the Bark and Below It. Do you feel ever like? Now, I did want to mention Will Cullen Hart. He calls it, quote, the thing giving nutrients to the tunes growing out of it, in that Quietus interview, which I think, again, sort of validated the way I was thinking about this. But do you ever feel like some of this stuff is more fun to think about than listen to?
A little bit, honestly. Bark and Below It, it kind of like ruins this album if you're listening to it in the car. You don't want to drive around for 11 minutes listening to that. The same reason I don't drive around listening to Cage or Stockhausen.
And it's weird, right? Because it's not like this cacophonous climax of the album.
No, it's quiet.
It's pretty muted.
It's very quiet.
It's very quiet.
No,
it's just like quiet. Often like a low drone with like some field recordings just getting like clipped up and everything, and just little like it'll be like a string flourish like whoop, like just flying by you, and then just silence.
Exactly, and it makes me think of Pre-Sisters Swallowing a Donkey's Eye from On Avery Island, which is sort of similar. It's another like very obvious Stockhausen piece, and Mangum at least had kind of the good sense to stick it at the end of the record, so you can still listen to it in the car. It's fine, you just end it, a little early.
And I love the idea of that piece, like this huge thing that's gonna like be the last note of the album. Like I love the idea, but I would almost never listen.
And no,
to the whole thing.
Exactly. Like I listen to that if I'm listening in headphones at night or something. But in the car, I always turn it off. Nobody wants to listen to that. But when you stick it sort of, I mean, it's not quite in the middle of the record, but it's sort of in the last 25% of it. It's sort of like really kind of wrecks the flow, because then you have that track, and it's nice in headphones. It's nice if you're into experimental things. It's a fun thing to like try to figure out the sounds and whatnot. But like I said, you don't want to hear it in the car. You don't really want to hear it, if you're playing this record at a party or something, which I guess that'd be sort of a weird party, anyways. But then I feel like it sort of struggles. It makes the rest of the record struggle a little bit. They've got to come back from that. And I kind of feel like all the songs, we got the Bark and Below It, and then we have another animation right after it. That's not exactly a banger bringing you back.
Because that Sylvan screen is kind of like a false beginning of and then we get like a false restart also at the end.
Exactly. And then it honestly sort of makes the rest of the, I hate to use this word, but normal songs sort of almost feel like now we're in the bonus tracks of the record.
Okay. Well, what do you think about that, Darren?
Well, I agree. I think I'm having more fun talking about the Bark and Below It with you guys than I do actually listening to it. I mentioned that the retrospective articles really kind of opened me up to some things. It opened me up to the Bark and Below It, because before it was like, I could do without it. You know what I mean? Like, I didn't think that skipping this track or not listening to it meant anything about that, how much I love the record. I just, whatever, they have this 11-minute experimental track. Thanks for not splitting it up over 9 tracks like you did on Cubist.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Yeah. Like, it was fine. I think it's the way you described it, Dan, makes sense. Like, obviously, if you're sitting down, you're focusing in on it, you're going to listen on headphones, you should listen to it. It flows really well with the rest of the album if you're doing it in that sense. In the car or pretty much anywhere else, like, no, of course not. That's not for that. You know what I mean? I hesitate to say that it's like, I wouldn't like cut it from the record or anything like that, because I still think that it has
it's like the key to unlocking the whole album, and yet it's hard to listen to.
Right. Gabe, how do you feel about the tracks after it though?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. It's sort of interesting to note. I never really thought about it before, but like, what, 1, 2, 3 of these tracks are, you know, these kind of strange, you know, sound collage type things anyway.
Right.
So it doesn't leave a lot of time to get the thing built back up. And you kind of hinted, Dan, that you don't think it like totally gets it going again. Mm-hmm. And I do agree that, like, you know, stuff like California Demise it's really awesome and has such a strange, like, where the bridge is just totally unrelated to the song and then it somehow ties back in the end. Or like, I think that Another Set of Bees in the Museum is like, it might be the weirdest song on the album, even including Barking Below It, because I understand what Barking Below It is trying to do. And Another Set of Bees is like so weird, but then so awesome at the same time. It almost sounds sometimes like the vocals are on the wrong song or something. But, you know, it's kind of like when you get to Mystery is like just one of those pure pop songs that kind of maybe should have been on side A, you know, when that was like, you know, kind of Hideaway style. And it feels weird. Like, how can we already be back at Mystery after the insanity that was Barking Below It? Is that kind of how you feel, Darren?
Yeah, because, you know, just even thinking about before when I loved this record, like, these last tracks were among the least listened to, I would say. You know what I mean?
Right.
If I didn't have time to go through 70 minutes of the album, I'm spending all my time in the first, you know, 16, 17 tracks or so, or whatever. You know what I mean? Like,
exactly.
Right.
Because, and then if you do sit through the Barking Below It, like, you know, going through another 7 tracks, I mean, that's a lot. You know what I mean? It just is. And knowing that none of those 7 tracks are they're not better than any of the tracks in the beginning of the album. You know what I mean? I like Hilltop Procession.
Yeah,
you know,
I mean, we must admit that that's like, it's kind of a wonderful closer. I mean, like,
for sure.
I find that the end of Black Foliage 5, like, this piano comes in and it's like, I'm like, wow, this is kind of moving, because this is not an album I would describe as moving really, but all of a sudden there's that moment that I'm like, wow, this is really like gorgeous. Mm-hmm. And then Hilltop Procession maybe starts off a little goofy, but by the end with that sing-along thing, I'm like, you know, it makes me want to cry or something. And it just sort of like retrospectively adds this kind of emotional weight to the whole album. Am I alone in that?
No, I agree with you. Hilltop is like sort of the song that does bring it back after Barking Below It. But unfortunately, the record's over at that point.
Yeah.
You know, but it is a good closer.
It makes me like really sad now because, you know, I just think of like Bill Doss passing away.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's so joyous with everybody singing along, and like the Elephant Six doesn't really exist anymore. This is the last Olivia Tremor Control album. You know, it's just like, it's kind of heartbreaking for some reason.
A little bit, you know, but one thing I want to say about Barking Below It, you know, earlier I said that this record sort of like accomplishes what John Lennon wanted to with Revolution 9, you know, this marrying of the experimental and the, you know, pop. The Barking, and I think everything before that song sort of successfully does that. But the Barking Below It, like, sort of is the Revolution 9 of this record.
It is.
And it's like, you know, you guys, I don't want to say that you blew it, but you kind of blew it a little bit. You know, like, this record didn't need the Revolution 9. You know, it was Revolution 9 meets, you know, While My Guitar Gently Weeps. And then that one, they sort of, you know, we didn't succeed quite 100%. You know, I think I don't know. I think if they had either used it at like Pre-Sisters, being the closing track, or just kind of done away with it, or maybe shortened it, or even split it up into split it up into like the combinations, animation, all those, like I like the Barking Below It. It's a fun thing to discuss scholastically, but it's not that great of a thing to listen to just in the context of the record, and that's sort of the same way I feel about Revolution 9. I like to listen to Revolution 9 at night with headphones.
But you're almost through by the time you get to Revolution 9.
Exactly.
You're like,
there's only one more song.
Just got to get through this, and then Good Night.
And there's one more song. And I feel like Good Night is probably the least listened to track on the White Album,
Well, certainly.
And it's like here we've still got, 5 more songs or 6 more songs?
You got a while.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like it ruins it a little bit.
I would just say, like, if this was at the end of the record, I would never listen to it. You know what I mean?
That's true.
It would be too difficult to ever get myself to want to listen.
I know, but that's what I'm saying. That's what Pre-Sisters is. You listen to Pre-Sisters, once, and then you listen to it when you feel like kind of dissecting a piece of experimental music. But when it's in the middle of more songs, it just sort of forces you, no matter what mood you're in or what you're trying, where, if you're in the car or you're, laying in bed with headphones on, it like sort of forces you to listen to this. And I guess artistically, maybe that's okay. I don't know. I don't hate it.
Yeah.
I don't hate it. I just,
it's in some ways it's a deliberately challenging album, and this is a big reason why. And I mean, I think it just comes down to, when he says it's this thing giving nutrients to the tunes growing out of it, I'm like, fucking love that idea.
Yeah, I do too, actually.
And I wouldn't remove it because I think it's so essential to the idea of this album, but I just, it's not like, and I like listening to shit like that, but I don't find this one, I don't find this one like that listenable, to be honest. I think that we could kind of wrap things up with this last question, which is, I started the episode by sort of asking, we're going to try to figure out like what makes this such an enduring classic. But in fact, I think that there's something kind of interesting about the fact that this inspired all this retrospective analysis. And when I say reassessment, I really think that I'm not alone in having thought that this was something like a hidden gem, and now thinking it's kind of like a bona fide masterpiece, an important album that everybody should hear, whether you're in an Elephant Six mood or not. So, I guess that's the central question. Like, why are people, why this change of assessment? Do you guys agree with that? And I mean, what is it that's got everybody talking about it all of a sudden?
Yeah, I mean, I basically said it before, this, whenever I was in, like, I only listened to this record if I was in sort of an Elephant Six mood, and I, moved past the big heavy hitters. I don't know what exactly, maybe other people sort of felt the same way and are realizing that this one really does kind of stand on its own legs. I don't know why, everybody maybe recently realized that, but I think it really does. I always kind of thought of Olivia Tremor Control and kind of especially this record as the second tier classics of Elephant Six, when maybe it's first tier. I don't want to.
Gotta be.
I think I sort of struggled to put it in the first tier because I think In the Airplane Over the Sea is one of the greatest records ever made, and I don't know if this sort of reaches that, but it definitely, I think, deserves to stand on its own. I'm super glad that this is really kind of the first time I've listened to this record completely isolated from Elephant Six and everything. And, it does have its own legs and it does have its own merit. And I think I've sort of unfairly, I don't say maligned, but, almost maligned it in the past.
Overlooked a little bit.
Overlooked. Yeah, that's a much better word.
What about you, Darren?
Yeah, I kind of disagree with you, Dan. I think, early on, I had always considered this one of the staples of Elephant Six, right? One of the best records. If you're getting into Elephant Six, this one's got to be in your top 3 that you got to listen to, right? But thinking back on it, listening to it so much, I'm a little more inclined to think about this record not as an Elephant Six record, but just as a record on its own right. The same way that I think of In the Aeroplane of Over the Sea being one of the greatest albums just in general. I think Black Foliage is one of the greatest masterpieces. You know what I mean? I would, from now on, I don't really think I'm going to talk about this in context of Elephant Six only. This is a great record in general. Forgetting the whole Elephant Six thing. I mean, that's a big part of it, obviously, but just in general, if you love music, right? This is a record you should hear.
Yeah, I think I'm in the exact same boat where I used to think of it as a classic of the Elephant Six, and now I think of it as just a classic. And I think that was sort of the goal of some of these retrospective reviews, and I'm really glad they did that because it got me rethinking about it, and I hope it gets a lot of other people rethinking about it because I think it's a really, really great record. And that being said, we sort of talked about the idea of maybe doing some more Elephant Six classics in the future, and I hope we do because despite all of that, I really badly want to listen to Gay Parade and fucking Avery Island and just all get deep into it. But I wonder if it would be possible. I kind of wonder now how would these albums stand up if I tried to separate them from their context. Who knows?
Yeah, I completely agree. This whole time discussion, the whole time we've been discussing, the whole time I was listening to this record, it's all I want to do is go and listen to all those other records. Right. It's so hard to fight that feeling. But we should definitely get to some of the other Elephant Six things in the future. But I think that's enough for this episode for today. Next week, we're going to try to do Scott Walker. He passed away. He's one of my favorites. I love him. You guys not as familiar, so I really want to dig into him. Yeah, double blunder here.
We'll dive in.
So looking forward to that. That'll be a lot of fun. So what do you think? Tell us what you think about Black Foliage, Elephant Six, Scott Walker, anything. You can tell us anything you want. popshieldpod@gmail.com. And if you like the show, help us out by subscribing. Leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast. You can stay connected. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all that junk is at popshieldpod. And we'll see you 2 weeks.
See ya.
So long.